A man in the Ethiopian highlands sends off a saliva sample the way anyone might. The result comes back, and a large share of his ancestry is listed as having come from outside Africa. Not a trace of it. Not a rounding error at the edge of the measurement. A substantial part of him sourced somewhere he has never been, from people no relative he can name has ever met. He has no European grandparent. His family has worked the same highland ground for as far back as anyone in it can count. And he is not a curiosity. Ask his neighbours and the same reading comes back, and it comes back again over the next range of hills in households whose language his own household cannot understand. Every easy explanation is available, and every one of them fails. It is not a colonial inheritance. It is not the slave trade running backwards. It is not soldiers or missionaries or anything a living person remembers, because all of that is far too recent and this is far too evenly spread. Whatever put it there had finished its work long before anybody thought to write about it. So the obvious next question is which direction it came from. And there is an obvious answer, because you can stand on the Ethiopian coast and very nearly see the other side. The water is narrow and people have crossed it for as long as there have been boats. The answer is not the other side of the water. It is somewhere else entirely. When the ancestry was compared against living populations to find its closest match, the best fit was not Arabia at all. It sat further north, in the Levant, the ground running up the eastern Mediterranean coast, hundreds of miles past the crossing point that everybody assumes. That is a strange result, and it is worth being precise about how strange, because nobody is claiming those people walked past Arabia without stopping. Ancestry is not a route map, and a genetic match tells you which population a signal most resembles, not the road it traveled. But it does mean the simplest story on the table, that this came from the neighbours across the strait, is not the story the DNA tells first. The scale is the other difficulty. Published estimates of how much of the genome this accounts for run high, up toward 40 or 50% in some Ethiopian groups. Though the figures move depending on which group is sampled and which method is used. And I'm giving you a range rather than a number, because the honest version of this has a range in it. Whatever it is not a visit. And it is not the kind of thing that leaves a trace and moves on, or traders leaving a few descendants in a port and sailing home. Something on the scale of a population arrived, and it arrived thoroughly enough that thousands of years later, it is still sitting in roughly half the genome of people living inland, in highlands at altitude, a long way from any coast. And there is one more thing about it. It is layered on top of ancestry that is not merely African, but among the oldest African ancestry there is. The male line in Ethiopia includes some of the deepest branching lineages on the entire human family tree. So, this is not a story about a people being replaced, but about a people who are very old and who at some point acquired a second inheritance from somewhere else. The question is when. There is only one way to answer a question like that properly, and it is to stop asking living people and go and ask a dead one. That is much harder in Africa than anywhere else, because ancient DNA survives in cold and dry conditions and degrades in warm and wet ones. Which is why the field spent its first years reading skeletons out of European caves and Siberian permafrost. While the continent where our species actually began stayed silent, for a long time there was no ancient African genome at all. Not one. Then a man came out of Mota Cave in the Gamo highlands of southwestern Ethiopia. He had been dead for roughly 4,500 years. He was read at 12.5 times coverage, which is to say properly read, not glimpsed. And he became the first ancient genome recovered anywhere in Africa. He is closest among people alive now to the Ari of the southwest, not to the people whose land holds the cave, which is its own quiet lesson about how much moves in 4,000 years. And here is the part that matters. The thing this whole video is about, that large non-African share, the ancestry sitting in the man who sent off the saliva sample, is not in him. It is not reduced in him. It is not faint in him. It is absent. So we have a fixed point, a man living in those highlands, in that landscape, at a moment when whatever arrived had not yet arrived. Everything else in this story has to fit on one side of him or the other. Now, I want to tell you what happened to that paper, because I would rather you heard it here than found it yourself and wondered what else I had left out. When the motor genome was first published, it came with a much bigger claim attached. The authors reported that this same Eurasian ancestry was detectable right across the continent. Not only in the Horn, but in West and Central Africa, in populations thousands of miles away with no plausible connection to any of this. It was a spectacular result, and it was reported everywhere. It was wrong. Not the fieldwork and not the sequencing, but a piece of software. A script that should have converted one program's output into a format another program could read was never run when the ancient genome was merged with the modern comparison panel. The effect was that positions where the ancient man matched the human reference were quietly thrown away as missing data. 2 other researchers found it, the correction was published, 2 supplementary tables were deleted, and the title of the paper itself was changed. From a claim about the African continent to a claim about Eastern Africa. What survived the correction is the part I have been telling you. The migration into East Africa from Western Eurasia from a source close to the early farming populations was not affected. The part that died was its reach. The backflow did not wash over Africa. It landed in the Horn and mostly stayed there. I'm telling you about a broken script in a genetics pipeline because it is the most reassuring thing in this video. The claim you're being asked to accept is the one that survived somebody actively trying to break it. There is another account of where the Ethiopian highlands got their outside inheritance, and it is far older than any of this, and it deserves better than a footnote. It is written in the Kebra Nagast, the glory of the kings. In it, the Queen of the South, Makeda, the woman the Bible calls the Queen of Sheba, travels to Jerusalem to see Solomon. She returns carrying his son. The son, Menelik, goes back to his father as a young man and comes home to Axum with the Ark of the Covenant. From him descends the line of Ethiopian kings. This is not folklore that sat harmlessly in a library. It is a claim that a state made about itself for centuries, and in the modern era it was written into the constitution as law. The revised constitution set out that the emperor descends without interruption from the dynasty of Menelik, the first son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon of Jerusalem. That is a legal document asserting a bloodline back to Jerusalem. And here is the part that is usually skipped, because it is inconvenient for people who want this to be simply a myth. There genuinely was an early, deep connection across that water, and you can go and stand in it. At Yaha in Tigray, there is a temple built in South Arabian style. It is roughly 27 centuries old. Script, religious forms and architecture from the Arabian side of the Red Sea are present in the Ethiopian highlands in stone, and the first known state in the region grew up around them. That is not a legend. It is a building. What is genuinely unresolved is what it means. Archaeologists still argue over whether that reflects people crossing in numbers and settling, or a local elite adopting the prestige style of a trading partner, which is a thing elites do everywhere and always have. So how does the account fare against the genetics? Partly well and partly badly, and I will give you both, starting with the fact that it fares well on timing. The recent gene flow is dated to roughly 3,000 years ago by 2 separate teams, and the window it brackets is not far off the world the story is set in. That is a real point in its favour, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It fares badly on geography. The closest match for that ancestry was the Levant rather than the Arabian Peninsula, and the story's route runs through Arabia. And the book itself is a late witness, since no manuscript names its compiler or its date. And the scholarly weight sits on a compilation more than 2,000 years after the events it describes. But the deepest problem is not any of that. It is that genetics cannot answer this kind of question at all. What these methods see is a population-scale event, thousands of people spread across centuries and averaged into a date with error bars on it. No study has found Sheba. No study could find Sheba. A single queen and a single son would leave no signal that any of these instruments can read. If you ever see a headline saying DNA has confirmed the Queen of Sheba, that headline is decoration laid over a real finding that says nothing of the kind. What is settled is that something arrived, and what is open is nearly everything else about it. Which brings me to the disagreement I have been holding back, and it is not a small one. Everything so far has treated this as one event, around 3,000 years ago. There is a serious argument that it is not one event, and that underneath it lies something very much older. The case runs like this. When Horn of Africa populations are examined closely, the non-African component in them does not look like a straightforward slice of any neighbour. It is distinct, significantly differentiated from the non-African ancestries of North Africa, the Levant and Arabia alike. It has its own character, and it looks like something that separated from all of them a long time ago and then sat here in the Horn evolving on its own. How long ago is the striking part? Because the estimate is that it diverged from every other non-African ancestry at least 23,000 years ago. And the authors are careful to say their dates are probably underestimates, which means this is not a variation on 3,000. It is more than 7 times older, and it puts the arrival before farming existed anywhere. There is a supporting detail I like, because it is the kind of evidence that is hard to argue with. There is a genetic variant for digesting milk that spread out of Arabia a few thousand years ago. If this component had come across with that later Arabian contact, you would expect it to be carrying that variant, and it is not. So there may be 2 doors, not one. An old one opened before agriculture by people who came back into Africa and stayed long enough to become their own thing. And a recent one 3,000 years ago from further north on the scale that shows up in a modern saliva test. I'm not going to tell you which is right because the field has not settled it. What I can tell you is that the disagreement is about the deep layer, not the recent one. That an ancestry came back into the Horn from outside Africa is not in dispute by anyone. How many times and how long ago is entirely in dispute. There is one more pattern in the Ethiopian data, and it is the one I find hardest to shake. Ethiopia is not one people and has never pretended to be. 3 separate language families share it. There are the Semitic languages, Amharic and Tigrinya, and the old liturgical Ge'ez, which have relatives across the Red Sea. There are the Cushitic languages, Oromo and Somali and Afar, and there are the Omotic languages of the southwest, spoken by the Ari among others. The people the man in the cave turned out to be closest to. When the genetics of Ethiopian populations was mapped, the structure that came out did not follow the geography as neatly as you would expect. It followed the languages, and which family a community speaks predicts its ancestry better than where it happens to live. The paper that reported it put the finding in its own title and called it linguistic stratification, and it is worth thinking about what that actually requires. It requires that for thousands of years in a country of open highland and shared markets and adjacent valleys, people have overwhelmingly had children with people who spoke as they did. Not by decree, not by any policy, just by the ordinary gravity of who you talk to and who your family knows. The language boundaries turn out to have been the real boundaries, and they have held, though there is one crack in it worth naming. The Semitic and Cushitic groups overlap genetically more than their languages would suggest, and those languages are not mutually intelligible at all. So the rule is a strong tendency, not a wall. I want to finish with the part of this that is not about arrivals at all, because there is something the highlands themselves did to the people living in them. Ethiopians on high ground live where the air is thin. So do Tibetans and so do Andeans, and all three populations have been studied hard to see what a body does about it over enough generations. The Andean answer is the intuitive one: thin air, less oxygen per breath, so make more of the machinery that carries it. Andean highlanders run markedly high hemoglobin, which is the solution you would design. Ethiopians do not do that, and their hemoglobin sits close to the range of people at sea level. They are living high, working high, and are not visibly compensating in the blood at all. Tibetans do something similar, which is why the two are often mentioned together. But they are not doing the Tibetan thing either. In Tibetans, the mechanism was traced to specific genes, one of which arrived in their ancestors from an archaic human population entirely. When those same genes were tested against hemoglobin levels in Ethiopian highlanders, there was no significant association, so the Tibetan answer does not explain the Ethiopian one. What the Ethiopian scans turn up instead is a different set of candidates. Some sit in the same oxygen sensing pathway as the Tibetan and Andean genes, the same system approached at a different point. Different genes, same machinery. Three populations on three continents walked into the same problem and came out with three answers, and two of them declined to use the obvious one. I should be honest that this is live science and not a closed file. Whether one of the famous Tibetan genes plays some role in some Ethiopian populations is currently argued both ways, and it is not resolved. Let me separate what holds from what does not, because a lot of this video has been ranges and arguments, and you are owed a plain statement of where the ground is firm. Settled, a substantial non-African ancestry component exists across Horn of Africa populations, and it is large, not marginal. Settled, it sits on top of some of the oldest African ancestry in the world, not in place of it. Settled, a man who lived in those highlands 4,500 years ago does not carry it, so at least some of it arrived after him. Settled, the recent pulse is dated by two independent teams to roughly 3,000 years ago and matches the Levant more closely than Arabia. Not settled, how much exactly and in which communities, because the published figures move with the sample. Not settled, whether that recent pulse is the whole story or the top layer over something more than 20,000 years older. Not settled, what the Sabaean stonework in Tigray actually represents in people. Not settled and not answerable by any of these methods, anything about any individual named in any account, including the one written into a constitution. That is a lot of open questions, and I would rather hand you the open ones than a tidy version that would not survive you reading the papers. Here is the thing I keep coming back to. Every person outside Africa is descended from people who walked out of it. That is the founding migration of our species, the one everything else in human history sits downstream of, and it runs in one direction. Out. The Horn of Africa is where the traffic went the other way. Whether once or twice, whether before farming or long after, some portion of the people who had left came back. And they did not arrive in an empty landscape, but among the descendants of the ones who never went, whose lineages are among the deepest and oldest anywhere on the tree. So the man who sent off the saliva sample is carrying both. He carries the branch that stayed, and he carries the branch that left and returned in one body at the top of a highland valley, several thousand years after they found each other again. We tend to describe the peopling of the world as a departure. A door opened, everyone walked through it, and history began on the other side, and the Ethiopian highlands are the evidence that the door was never one way. Somebody came back. And whoever they were, they are still here, in the blood of people buying bread this morning in Addis Ababa, who have no idea they are the place where the journey out and the journey home are both written down.